Glory to Ukraine. Hello, dear friends. My name is Vladlen Mariev, and you are on the History Without Myths channel, where we talk about the past of Ukraine and the world without embellishment or falsification. Subscribe to History Without Myths and click on the bell to not miss our new issues. Let Ukrainian YouTube flourish. 90 years ago, on January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Reich Chancellor of Germany. This event was neither the result of an armed coup, as in the history of the Russian Bolsheviks, nor the result of a vote in parliament. But the result of Hitler's becoming Reich Chancellor was the gradual establishment of the Nazi dictatorship, totalitarian dictatorship, and unlimited power of the Führer in Germany over the course of a year and a half, from January 1933 to August 1934. How did Germany go from the democratic Weimar Republic to the totalitarian Third Reich? What ideas did Hitler promote in his programmatic works, Mein Kampf and The Second Book? What was the program of his party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP for short? We will discuss this in today's issue. And at the end of the stream, I will traditionally answer your questions via chat. So, dear friends, I ask you to write your questions towards the end of the video. German Nazism, like the Bolshevik dictatorship or Italian fascism, was a direct outgrowth of the First World War. In the case of Germany, it was a product of the immediate results of the war. Of course, the long-awaited peace, especially after such a long event as the World War, which lasted 4 years and 4 months, is a joyful event, peace. However, for the Germans in 1918, peace brought a very grim reality. The First World War ended on November 11 with the signing of the Armistice of Compiègne in Marshal Foch's staff car. Germany, the last of all the Central Powers, recognized its defeat, as Bulgaria, then the Ottoman Empire, and finally Austria-Hungary were forced to sign an armistice. At the same time, Austria-Hungary split into several states, and a revolution broke out in Germany. And the revolution led to the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II and his forced flight to the neutral Netherlands. After that, Germany ceased to be a monarchy forever. Exhausted by a long and very difficult war, this country suffered great human losses. More than 2 million dead and more than 4,200,000 wounded. These are only military losses, because tens or even hundreds of thousands of civilians died of exhaustion and starvation, especially in the last 2 years of the war. It should be added that at the end of the war, Germany, like the rest of Europe, was hit by a Spanish flu pandemic. The pandemic will last until the early 1920s, and several million people will die from it. The official end of the war for Germany was the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919. The terms of the treaty were so unfavorable that German diplomats refused to sign the document until the Entente representatives issued an ultimatum, threatening to resume hostilities. Thus, according to this treaty, Germany lost 13% of its pre-war territory to neighboring countries. First of all, these were France, Belgium, Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, and Czechoslovakia. All the colonies that Germany had had before the outbreak of World War I passed into the hands of the victors, Great Britain and France. Belgium, Portugal, Japan. Germany has lost very economically powerful regions, Alsace and Lorraine, as well as Upper Silesia, which account for a significant share of coal and iron ore production. Only a token armed force remained in the country, especially compared to the Kaiser's army, which at one time was the strongest continental army in Europe and had enormous authority in German society. The size of the armed forces, called the Reichswehr, was limited to 100,000 soldiers. In addition, they were forbidden to have airplanes, tanks, and submarines, and the surface fleet was significantly reduced. Fortifications on Germany's western borders were to be demolished. In addition, huge reparations were imposed on the country, the final amount of which was not initially determined, and they severely undermined the economy, which was already depleted by the war. In addition, the Treaty of Versailles placed the primary responsibility for the outbreak of war on Germany, although I would remind you that Austria-Hungary actually started the war by attacking Serbia on July 28, 1914. And the perpetrators of the war were in fact all the great countries of that time, which organized a real pursuit and struggle for a new division of the world. And they planned to hold a show trial of the former Kaiser Wilhelm. But the Netherlands refused to extradite him, the trial did not take place, and the former Kaiser Wilhelm lived in this country until the end of his days in 1941. The political activist Otto Strasser described the situation in Germany after the end of World War I in this way.
Germany lost the war, but that's not all. People were starving, and the countries of Central Europe were literally strangled by the blockade. 120 million German marks were invested in military loans. The middle class was destroyed, small rentiers went bankrupt, insurance companies stopped all payments, men and women who had been saving for a normal existence in old age lost their savings and died in absolute poverty. War veterans did not receive pensions. This state of affairs was not a consequence of the difficult Treaty of Versailles, as one might assume, but a direct result of the war, which completely destroyed the country's economic life.
It goes without saying that in the post-war years, millions of Germans found themselves in despair and a prolonged depression. This has created a very favorable environment for various revanchist forces that will promise their fellow citizens to restore justice and regain Germany's lost greatness. And one of these political forces was the National Socialist Party, which was headed by Adolf Hitler in 1931. But first, it is worth analyzing what the so-called Weimar Republic, i.e. Germany after the First World War and before the Nazi dictatorship, was like. Why the Weimar Republic? This is how Germany was conventionally called from the end of 1918 to the beginning of 1933. It was an intermediate stage of history between monarchy and dictatorship, when the country was trying to build a democratic system. The Weimar state is so called because it was formed at the Constituent Assembly of Germany in 1919 in the city of Weimar, which is located in Thuringia, in fact, in the center of the country. In Ukraine, this city is often called Vejmar, although the German name of the city sounds like Vajmar. In fact, the name, Weimar Republic, did not officially exist. And during the times of the Empire, and during the times of the Republic, and even during the times of the Hitler dictatorship, the country was officially called Deutsches Reich. What does German state mean? But in the last years of Nazism, the name Großdeutsches Reich, that is, Great German State, was more often used. The Weimar Republic was a mixed federal state with a strong bicameral parliament and a president who appointed the chancellor, i.e. the head of government, and the government itself was accountable to the parliament rather than the president. Over the 14 years of this republic's existence, 12 chancellors and 21 members of the government have changed, which is a very unstable situation. The situation is very similar to the governmental mess in Italy. The Weimar Republic was established in 1919 by a coalition of three center and center-left political parties. These were the Social Democrats, the Left Liberals, and the Catholics, or the so-called Party of the Center. However, they soon lost the majority of their parliaments. And centrist forces have always felt strong pressure, both from the communists on the left and from the conservatives and national socialists on the right, as well as from monarchists and supporters of Prussian militarism. At the same time, the right and left forces, which could not agree with each other, usually had a majority in parliament. And the centrist forces that were supposed to become the foundation and basis of this republic were in the minority. As a result, the Weimar Republic was constantly rocked like a ship in a storm, and it was only a matter of time before it would end up where it was. Will it roll over to the right side or to the left? The Nazi beer putsch organized in Munich in 1933 was only one of many attempts to overthrow the current regime. The next putsch was more dangerous than the Nazi uprising in Munich. The so-called Kapp-Luttwitz putsch, the two generals Kapp and Luttwitz. Or it is also called the Kappa Rebellion, which took place in March of 1920 in Berlin. The mutiny was organized by the military, which wanted a dictatorship, but only a massive strike by German workers could stop the coup. More than 12 million workers stopped working during the strike, which is considered the largest in German history. It completely paralyzed the country, resulting in the failure of the Kappa-Luttwitz putsch, and its organizers were forced to flee the country. The situation of the Weimar Republic stabilized only for a short period from 1924 to 1929. First, at that time Germany began to receive large foreign loans. And secondly, the issue of reparations was finally resolved and a general economic recovery began. You remember, for example, in the United States, it was a time of economic prosperity, i.e., a general increase in living standards, and it seemed that happy times had finally arrived. Or the happy, peaceful times of the world's development. But the stock market crash that occurred in the fall of 1929 in the United States hit Europe hard, and Germany was the hardest hit. This destroyed all the achievements of short-term stabilization. Germany again found itself in an economic crisis, which led to a political crisis, and eventually it all culminated in the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship. At the same time, the country's president since 1925 was a representative of conservative monarchist forces, Paul von Hindenburg. Former chief of the General Staff of the German Empire, former commander-in-chief of German troops on the Eastern Front, i.e. against Russia. He had a high reputation in society, but he was a very old man. At the beginning of Hindenburg's reign he was 77 years old. And at the time of completion, he was 86. By the way, this is the only president in German history who was elected in national elections, not by voting in parliament or in the Constituent Assembly. Despite his advanced age, in 1932 he was re-elected for a second term, and it was Hindenburg who appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor. Hitler's biography is generally very well known, and this is a huge topic that we can later consider in a separate special issue devoted to the figure of Hitler. But since Nazism, as an ideology and political movement, cannot be separated from the personality of Hitler, it is now worthwhile to focus on some key episodes of his biography. The goal is to explain exactly how Hitler came to be the leader of the Nazi Party. There is a very common myth that Hitler's real name was Schicklgruber, but this is not true, as his father, whose name was Alois, had the surname Schicklgruber. However, he changed the name, Schicklgruber, to Hitler, before Adolf was born. Adolf Hitler himself was born on April 20, 1889, in the small town of Braunau am Inn, that is, Braunau on the Inn River. At that time, this river was the border between the German Empire and Austria-Hungary, and now it is the border between Austria and the Federal Republic of Germany, respectively. Accordingly, by birth Hitler was a subject of the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I of the Habsburg dynasty, but he did not consider himself a patriot of his homeland. Later, Hitler wrote that he considered his birth in this city, on the border of two empires, a very lucky symbol. Why? He said his mission was to unite all Germans into one national state. The fact is that Austrians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries mostly considered themselves Germans, saying that we were one people. And the formation of one's own, purely Austrian identity will begin actively only after World War II, after the defeat of Nazism, because then the ideas of pan-Germanism, the unification of all Germans, including Austrians, will be condemned. This would be considered, well, absolutely unacceptable. At the beginning of the 20th century, the idea of the unity of Austrians and Germans as a single people, and thus the need to create a single state, was very popular. And Hitler dreamed of eliminating this historical injustice, eliminating this state border. Especially after the Treaty of Versailles, in one of its clauses, explicitly forbade the Anschluss, the unification of Germany with Austria, so as not to strengthen Germany. From his youth, Hitler became a German nationalist, and in addition, an extreme anti-Semite. Today we will talk about his anti-Semitism in more detail. And this is a photo of Hitler from his school years. It is worth saying that he constantly regretted being born in a time of peace, when nothing worthy of serious attention seemed to be happening in the world. There were no great conquests and powerful wars of liberation to be proud of and to participate in. Indeed, after the Franco-Prussian War, which ended in 1871 with the formation of the German Empire, Western Europe did not know large-scale wars for 43 years. That is why the political figures of the time seemed to the young Hitler, as he himself wrote, to be frauds, swindlers, traitors, and just petty officials. He considered only Bismarck to be a figure worthy of respect. But Hitler did not actually see Bismarck in power because Bismarck resigned in 1890, when Hitler was only 1 year old. As a child, he avidly followed international news, especially when the war broke out. And, by the way, he later wrote that during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905 he clearly took a position in support of Japan. As a subject of the Austrian Emperor, Hitler categorically did not want to serve in the Austro-Hungarian army. Why? Because they were tolerant of Slavs. According to him, there was a policy of Slavicization of the empire, for which he blamed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was married to Sophia Hodek, a Czech by birth, most of all. As you know, this married couple was murdered together on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia, which caused the outbreak of World War I. In 1913, Hitler, after unsuccessful attempts to enter the Art Academy, he moved to Germany, to Munich, where he studied painting. But the Austrian authorities believed that he was evading military service. And as a result, the Austrians were able to force the Bavarian police to deport Hitler back to Austria. He was deported anyway, underwent a medical examination and was found unfit for military service for health reasons. He was then able to return to Munich just before the outbreak of World War II. But as soon as the war began, Hitler immediately volunteered for the German army. What he really always wanted. Namely, in a Bavarian infantry regiment, despite the fact that he was a foreigner and had no military training. Hitler spent 4 years at the front, from October 1914 to October 1918. Later, he always worked diligently on the image of a veteran who went through all the horrors of trench warfare, although in reality, Hitler spent a large part of the war as a liaison in the rear, that is, in relative safety, so to speak, although this did not exclude his participation in combat. As a result, in October 1916, he was wounded by grenade fragments. And at the very end of the war, in October of 1916, he came under a British gas attack, which temporarily lost his eyesight. In addition, Hitler was awarded the Iron Cross of the First and Second Class, and was promoted to the rank of corporal. He met the Armistice of Campaign in November 1918 in the hospital where he was staying after a gas attack. It was a real shock for him. He sincerely believed in Germany's victory and believed that the revolution that began in November 1918 was a conspiracy in the rear. A conspiracy between Marxists and Jews. The so-called stabbing in the back theory. 4 years of war in difficult and unequal conditions for Germany simply came to nothing. All efforts are in vain. Hitler is terribly disappointed. And he is full of rage against the leftist revolutionaries. At the same time, it practically equates revolutionaries, leftist revolutionaries, Marxists, and Jews. But it must be said that many Germans shared his opinion. Why? Because, despite all the economic difficulties, as of the fall of 1918, the German army was scattered over vast areas from northern Italy, France, and Belgium to Ukraine, the Don, and Finland. And there was not a single enemy soldier on German territory, which created the illusion that the war was quite successful for Germany, because it was fighting on foreign territory. In 1919, Hitler began his political career in Munich. At that time he was still serving in the German army. Not having his own home, he lived in a barracks. At the same time, Hitler later always emphasized how difficult and needy his life was. How often he suffered, starved. And he often did this in order to evoke a certain emotional reaction in poor Germans and to show them that he was just like them, a man of the people, a simple man who went through all the suffering like most Germans. Even Hitler described such episodes when he fed pet mice while living in a barracks.
There were a lot of mice in my house, and I would leave them bread crusts or bones, around which the mice would start a desperate fuss in the morning. When I woke up, I used to lie in bed with my eyes open and watch these animals play. I have been hungry a lot in my life, and I understand very well how much pleasure these crusts of bread give to hungry mice.
So, one day in 1919, when Hitler was still serving in the German army, he attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. The meeting, to be honest, was more like a hobby group, as the official party members at the time numbered just over 60. There, when he asked for the floor, he made a fiery speech about the unjust Treaty of Versailles. About the need to return to a powerful Germany, to abolish the whole unjust world that was established in the post-war period, and to punish the revolutionaries, Marxists, and Jews for the revolution they had organized. This speech was a success. As it turned out, none of the members of the German Workers' Party was such an outstanding speaker, so Hitler was offered to join the party. Which he did, after some thought. At that time, the party was led by sports journalist Karl Harrer and Anton Drexler, a locksmith who worked in a Munich railroad depot. It must be said that Hitler soon proved himself to be an extremely outstanding speaker. Despite the huge gaps in his worldview and the confusion of knowledge in his head, gleaned from different books, he read a lot, but in a chaotic and disorganized manner. And he did not receive a full education. Nevertheless, to most listeners who did not know all this, he seemed very intelligent and well-read, and the emotional fervor with which he spoke really made him believable. Like. A person who speaks so confidently and emotionally cannot be lying. Hitler's speeches mostly took place in Munich beer halls. We all know that Germans have a culture of beer consumption, and they often spend their free time there. And large beer halls allowed hundreds of people to gather there, and sometimes even several thousand, such as Munich beer halls such as Sternecker Broge, Burger Brokeller, Hofbraukeller, Hofbräuhaus. Hitler quickly had the party renamed from the Workers' Party to the National Socialist Workers' Party. And in 1921, he gradually removed Harrer and Drexler from the leadership. And he was made the leader of the party because he was the most popular politician in the party. The National Socialists needed him because people really went to his speeches, listened to his speeches, and no one could ignite the audience with his speech. And as a result, it was Hitler who became the leader of the new party. At the same time, Harrer and Drexler accused him of delusions of grandeur. And even in provocative activities. But, being on the sidelines of political life, they ended their lives in complete oblivion. Harrer died at the age of 35, apparently of sudden cardiac arrest. Anton Drexler abused alcohol. And he suffered from depression. He died at the age of 57. During World War II. In February of 1920, during a speech at the Hofbräuhaus, Hitler presented the party program known as the 25 Points. The party already had the name National Socialist German Workers' Party, but was better known by the German abbreviation NSDAP, Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. On April 1, 1920, this program, the 25 Points, was approved and remained unchanged until the collapse of the Nazi regime. Hitler always categorically denied making any changes to the program. In reality, however, it was a very short, undetailed program that looked more like a political propaganda manifesto. These were the simplest theses that could explain the purpose of the party in the simplest form, even to a completely uninformed German. Its full text can be easily found on the internet, and now we will quote the most important points.
First, we demand the unification of all Germans on the basis of the right of peoples to self-determination into a greater Germany. Secondly, we demand equality of the German people on an equal footing with other nations and the abolition of the provisions of the Versailles and Saint-Germain peace treaties. Thirdly, we demand the territories and lands of the colonies for the maintenance of the German people and the resettlement of the surplus population. Fourth, only those who belong to the German people can be citizens of the state. Belonging to a nation is determined by blood ties to the German nation, regardless of religious affiliation. Thus, no Jew can belong to the German people. Seventhly, we demand that the state should be primarily concerned with the employment and life of German citizens. If it is not possible to provide for the entire German population, then persons belonging to foreign nations who are not citizens of the state should be deported. Eighth, all further immigration of non-German population should be stopped. 10th, the first duty of German citizens is mental or physical labor. The activities of an individual citizen should not contradict the interests of society as a whole, taking place within its borders and for the common good.
We can say that this was the radical nationalist part of the program, followed by the socialist part. For example, the abolition of so-called non-labor income, the acquisition of industrial trusts, the involvement of workers in the distribution of profits of large enterprises. Expropriation of land from large landowners, without monetary compensation for them, and large-scale increases in pensions. Improving social security, returning to a conscript army instead of a contract army, and establishing a strong centralized government. At the same time, in 1920, at Hitler's insistence, the National Socialist Party flag was introduced, which would later become the national flag of Germany. As you know, it was a red flag with a white circle in the center and a black swastika inside the circle. Moreover, the Nazis did not call it a swastika, but a Hakenkreuz, or hooked cross. This is how Hitler explained this symbolism.
The red color symbolizes the social ideas embedded in our movement, the white color symbolizes the idea of nationalism, and the swastika symbolizes the mission of fighting for the victory of the Aryans and, at the same time, for the victory of creative labor, which has always been anti-Semitic and will remain anti-Semitic.
Gradually, the party began to gain popularity, although it was largely unknown in Bavaria and other regions of Germany at the time. It remained a provincial, relatively small party, but already in December 1920, the Nazis acquired the newspaper Völkischer Beobachter, People's Observer, which became their main printed organ for propagating their ideas. In addition, Hitler began to form so-called assault units from the fighters. In fact, it was an urgent need for him, as he constantly had conflicts with communists who came to disrupt National Socialist rallies. And these clashes often escalated into real battles with numerous wounded, traumatized, or even killed. In the fall of 1923, the NSDAP's membership reached 55,000 people. But it was still a local party, because, for example, their absolute opponents, the German Communists, numbered about 300,000. It was the second largest communist party in Europe after the Russian Bolsheviks. And it was in the fall of 1923 that Hitler decided to take decisive action, an attempted coup d'état. He was motivated by several factors, the first and foremost of which is the occupation of the Ruhr Basin by the French, Belgians, and British in 1933 due to Germany's delay in paying reparations. The German government, then headed by Wilhelm Kuno, decided only on a policy of passive resistance. He called on German workers in the Ruhr Basin to stop going to work, but as a result, the government was forced to pay workers for all this downtime. To cover these costs, Berlin was forced to simply print new banknotes. Of course, this set in motion a flywheel of hyperinflation, currency depreciation, rapid price increases, and a new economic crisis. During economic crises, left-wing political forces always become more active, and the threat of a communist coup in the country has increased. Therefore, Hitler appears as an actor who seeks to prevent the communist threat and to carry out a right-wing coup. Benito Mussolini's fascist march on Rome in 1922 was a source of inspiration for Hitler. We recently discussed this on the Real Fascism stream. Exactly 1 year passed since those events, and Hitler tried to repeat what Mussolini had done in Italy. Interestingly enough, in Italy, the Nazis marched mainly from north to south, from Milan to Rome. In Germany, the Nazi march was planned in the opposite direction, from south to north, from Munich to Berlin. This is because the so-called Bierputsch, which began with a rally in a Munich beer hall on November 8–9, 1923, was poorly organized. Its leaders acted uncoordinated, and they did not reach Berlin with this march, and did not even leave Munich. Because at Odeonsplatz, a firefight with the police and army ensued, and the Nazi demonstration was suppressed. Hitler hid for 2 days in the apartment of one of his friends, but then he was discovered and arrested. By the way, it was then, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he talked about the possibility of committing suicide. But he did not commit suicide, and some of his fellow party members felt that they had to make serious efforts to prevent him from committing suicide. The trial, which took place at the beginning of the 24th year, only added to Hitler's popularity, as it created a platform for him to spread his ideas. And from this rostrum, Hitler accused the local Bavarian government and the participants in the November Revolution of 1918 of treason. As a result, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but with the possibility of early pardon. The activities of the NSDAP were banned. In total, he was imprisoned for a little over a year. In December of 1924, Hitler was released. Moreover, his entire imprisonment, he spent his time in fairly comfortable conditions, he was visited regularly. He had very good food, they brought him a lot of food. And there he had the opportunity to write his software. Until the beer putsch in November 1923, Hitler was not aware of his role, so to speak. He considered himself, so to speak, the young drummer of the German people and bowed to the authority of such figures as Ludendorff or Hindenburg. Ludendorff himself took part in the beer putsch. But after Hitler was released, he seriously changed his views and believed in his own unique mission. The mission of the leader is to lead Germany out of the crisis and bring it to unprecedented prosperity and global power. In the Landsberg prison, in the year 1924, Hitler dictated the book Mein Kampf. He dictated the book to his colleague Rudolf Hess, the same Hess who would fly to Britain in May 1941. This book translates as My Struggle, but the German title Mein Kampf. In fact, if you read it, the book is very boring, it's very long, about 700 pages. The book is full of a kind of all-consuming pathos. And it is a mixture of different ideas that reflect Hitler's chaotic and unsystematic study of very different literature. The book was published in 2 volumes after his release. At intervals of 6 months, of course, they began to be published in extremely large numbers only after Hitler came to power. Thus, by the end of the Nazi dictatorship in 1945, a total of 11 million copies of Mein Kampf had been published. By the way, in Ukraine in 2009, the publication of the book My Struggle was banned by the decision of the National Expert Commission for the Protection of Public Morality. Then this state structure was liquidated in 2015. But much less well known than Mein Kampf is his second book, Zweit's book. It was written a little later, in 1928. In fact, it is a sequel to Mein Kampf, but it remained in draft form. The manuscript that was not completed was obviously not completed, and Hitler decided not to make it public. There were several reasons for this. First, Mein Kampf was not selling well at the time, and he did not see any interest from publishers in a new book. And secondly, he believed that his ideas on foreign policy were too frankly expressed in Zweit's book. Therefore, the book remained in manuscript and was found only after the war by the Americans, who conducted an examination and confirmed the authenticity of this text, and published the book for the first time in West Germany only in 1961. So, based on these two works, we can look into the We will look at Hitler's ideological ideas, the views he espoused, and the plans he had for the restructuring of both Germany and the world as a whole. Hitler believed that the education of citizens should begin from the earliest years of their lives, and he prioritized selection based on physical characteristics. Hitler admired ancient Sparta and even called it the first nation-state in the world. He was impressed by the system of selecting babies in Sparta. Remember when weak, infirm, sick children were simply killed there. He also liked the fact that the Spartans, who were very few in number, only 10,000, kept several 100,000 Helot slaves in subjection. This is what Hitler wrote about this experience.
The identification of the sick, the weak, the crippled, in short, their extermination, was more worthy and even 1,000 times more humane than the miserable madness of our time, which preserves the most pathological subjects. At the same time, it takes the lives of hundreds of thousands of healthy children through birth control or abortion to give birth to a race of degenerates burdened with disease.
In general, such ideas are a consequence of the so-called. In fact, it is hard to call it a science, but rather a doctrine of eugenics, which was very popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The doctrine of human selection and improvement of their heredity. But it is clear that such radical and cruel ideas. It was these ideas, on which Hitler developed his eugenics doctrine, that later led to horrific Nazi practices and experiments. For example, the T4 euthanasia program was sterilization and then killing. The murder of mentally ill and genetically diseased people, who were treated as parasites, unnecessary, superfluous people who eat up the state budget and allegedly cannot bring any social benefit. Or, for example, an experiment such as the Nazi organization Lebensborn, which made sure that both parents were of pure Aryan descent and gave birth to so-called racially pure children. In addition, Lebensborn. This organization was responsible for taking children from Nazi-occupied territories during World War II and determining whether they were suitable for Germanization. How can we not mention that now in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, the Russian occupiers are forcibly taking Ukrainian children to their territory? In this way, they carry out their propaganda from the first years of life, and transfer these children to completely strange Russian families. Hitler categorically rejected the existing system of school and higher education in Germany. This, by the way, reflected his life experience. According to numerous accounts, as a child Hitler was a very stubborn child, completely on his own, and at school he studied only those subjects that interested him, and simply ignored the rest. When he became an adult, he argued that it was necessary to reduce the teaching of science and mathematics, but at the same time increase the humanities. Hitler promoted a purely utilitarian approach to history. That is, to present history for schoolchildren, as he said, in terms of the racial problem and the need to keep the blood pure. And he paid great attention to the physical education of young people, as opposed to intellectual education.
We don't need physically weak people, even if they are well educated. We need physically healthy people with strong character, determined and energetic, even if their education is not broad enough. Only in the second place will we think about the development of spiritual abilities, It is absolutely inappropriate to overload young brains with such ballast as is done today. Give the German nation 6 million impeccably trained athletes filled with fanatical love for their country, and a true nation-state will be able to create a real army out of them in 2 years.
Hitler argued that gymnastics and sports in schools should be given at least 2 hours a day, with special attention paid to boxing. And of course, all this is to make the young men ready to serve in the army. Hitler himself, as they say now, led a healthy lifestyle, as he ate vegetarian food, hardly ever drank alcoholic beverages, and even in his youth he quit smoking. Then he explained that it was to save money, because he lived poorly at the time, and because he smoked cigarettes, sometimes he didn't even have money for food. So he threw the cigarettes into the Danube. And he stopped smoking forever. But witnesses note that Hitler himself lacked physical fitness, did not pay enough attention to it, and looked quite ill. According to Hitler's plan, only after completing compulsory military service could young men. After that, the young man received a diploma for the right to engage in public activities and the right to marry. Only after military service. Moreover, Hitler naively believed that early marriages, which he actively promoted, were a guarantee against prostitution and venereal disease. They say that if young people get married very early, they will not need to turn to prostitutes, and, accordingly, there will be no such spread of venereal diseases. At the same time, he somehow completely lost sight of the fact that very early marriages often end in divorce. But, of course, from Hitler's point of view, only physically healthy people with beautiful bodies should marry in order to give birth to physically strong, beautiful descendants. And as he wrote, in no case should racial mixing be allowed. The purity of blood was a concept that Hitler constantly used, and he convinced everyone that the Jews wanted to pollute the blood of the Aryans, which would lead to a rapid decline in the quality of the race, its degradation, and complete decline. Moreover, the fact that a person was born in Germany, in Hitler's view, did not mean that he or she was a German citizen. In any case, not by birth, citizenship must be obtained and earned to a certain extent. A person, even if he or she is a pure German or German, simply because he was born in Germany, he has no right to vote, cannot vote in elections and cannot participate in them. To become a citizen, a German had to go to school and then perform compulsory military service. And then take a solemn oath of allegiance to the state and the people. But women, he wrote, can only obtain citizenship after they get married. And only in exceptional cases. Unmarried women can obtain citizenship for great labor merit. In addition, criminals, traitors, or even just wimpy and dishonest people. I wonder who will determine the degree of this wimpiness and dishonesty. All these people can lose their citizenship at any time. As already mentioned in the NSDAP program, Jews could not have German citizenship at all, and this would be implemented by the Nazis in the infamous Nuremberg racist laws of 1935. In addition, Hitler considered all Marxist leaders to be Jews, with all the ensuing consequences.
All human culture is the result of the creative activity of an individual. The destructive activities of the Jews are reduced to an attempt to destroy the role of the individual and replace it with the role of the masses. Because of this, Jews turn into an enzyme for the decomposition of entire peoples and races, and they gradually destroy the entire human culture. Marxism is a Jewish policy aimed at systematically destroying the role of the individual in all spheres of human life and replacing it with the role of the majority.
hence the cult of the leader, to whom the nation must obey, and the leader must bear full responsibility to the nation. However, it never occurred to Hitler that in practice the nation has no real tools to control its leader. In Hitler's view, the principle of chieftaincy or Führerism implied the complete elimination of representative authorities. Only advisory bodies that will help the leader. At all levels, from the highest to the local communities, there will be leaders at various levels who will listen to the advice of advisory bodies. They will be taken into account, but they can make decisions alone and, accordingly, are accountable to the supreme leader Führer. Democracy, Hitler believed, is very harmful because it gives access to power to mediocrity and, conversely, suppresses outstanding personalities. And no doubt he considered himself an outstanding person. At least since his mid-20s, Hitler was convinced that he definitely stood out from the grey masses and believed in his historical mission, and this belief grew over time. From the very beginning of his political career, Hitler aimed to create the Third Reich. This is usually traditionally explained as follows. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation during the Middle Ages and early modern times. The Second Reich was the Hohenzollern Empire, and the Third Reich was Hitler's Nazi state. But there is other evidence, for example, from Otto Strasser, who writes that in 1920 Hitler called the German Hohenzollern Empire the First Reich, and that it existed from 1871 to 1988. The Second Reich is the interwar Weimar Republic, and the Third Reich is me, he said. Well, just like Louis XIV with his famous saying, the state is me. Hitler's anti-Semitism. This was known from the very beginning of his career, and he always emphasized this.
The existence of a Jew becomes a parasite on the lives of other peoples. The characteristics of cunning, intelligence, dexterity, fraud, and treachery are rooted in the character of his nation and serve as his weapon. Its ultimate goal is denationalization, the disorderly mixing of other peoples, the humiliation of the racial value of superior peoples, and the domination of the entire racial mixture by eradicating the national intelligentsia and replacing it with representatives of their own nation. The end of the Jewish world struggle, therefore, will always be bloody Bolshevization. After the successful revolution in Russia, Jews completely destroyed the boundaries of order, morality, and customs, and abolished marriage as a high institution. Instead, they announced general copulations, with the aim of dispelling general human confusion through chaotic bastardization.
To be honest, it has already taken the form of a real mania and obsession. Despite the fact that at that time the Jews did not have their own state, as Israel, as an independent state, would emerge only after World War II. Although Jewish political movements were extremely divided, there was a wide spectrum, from anarchists to Zionists. Despite the fact that different states had their own Jewish forces, parties, circles, and organizations, meaning that they did not form a large cohesive international community, Hitler believed in a worldwide conspiracy that harmed all of humanity. Here is an example of his direct speech from October 1920, a time when Hitler was virtually unknown throughout Germany.
The reality is the Jews. Look at the Jewish communist Marx and the Jewish capitalist Rathenau. All evil comes from the Jews who defile and pollute the world. As soon as I found out who they were, as soon as I recognized them, I started looking at every passerby on the street to determine whether they were Jewish or not. Jews control the social democratic press. Their goal is to destroy the nation and destroy differences between races. Jews are at the head of the labor movement and claim to improve the fate of workers. In fact, they seek to turn them into slaves, to kill their patriotism and honor in order to establish an international dictatorship of Jewry. Their organization is sophisticated and omnipresent, they have agents in all ministries. They pull the strings in the highest circles of the country.
Thus, in his anti-Semitism, Hitler was convinced that he was acting as a benefactor for all of humanity, and he held this view until his death. Even in April of 1945, when the fighting was already underway near Berlin, and when Hitler's suicide was a few weeks away. In one of the transcripts noted by Martin Bormann, Hitler stated that in the future humanity would be grateful to him for the extermination of the Jews of Germany and Central Europe. Well, here I must say that Hitler's maniacal views found a certain response in a society where the traditions of everyday anti-Semitism were very old. However, Hitler was able to escalate anti-Semitic sentiment to the maximum and turn Jews into real scapegoats. Who else but left-wing politicians could be blamed for all the problems of the society of that time? However, in Hitler's 1920 writings, there is no mention of the need for total genocide of all Jews. Or completely exterminate all Marxists, but there is a reference to the need for mass repression. In Mein Kampf, he regrets that at the beginning of the First World War the Germans did not dare to suffocate 12 to 15,000 Jewish leaders, speculators, usurers, and liars with poisonous gases. From 12 to 15,000, and a total of 500,000 of the Jewish population of Germany at the time. Then, if this had been done, all the sacrifices of the German people at the fronts would not have been in vain. And in the future, after coming to power, he dreamed of creating a national tribunal that would shoot several tens of thousands of people guilty of organizing the November Revolution of 1918, not only to punish them but also to intimidate all other supporters of the revolution forever. In general, he wrote openly that any means are real and justified to achieve the goal of their party, and all victims are the same. It is also worth emphasizing that Hitler and the Nazis in general constantly juggled the concepts of race and ethnicity, never providing a generally accepted precise definition. At the same time, they often used the word race as a synonym for people, or a whole group of peoples. For example, the Jewish race, the Slavic race, the Germanic race, the Nordic race, the Western or Eastern race. And what about Hitler's foreign policy plans? A lot has been written about this in Mein Kampf in Book 2. The main concept for him was the struggle, but the struggle for what? For life and living space. He absolutely despised international law and considered it something that imposed restrictions and prevented him from realizing his intentions. He has a famous phrase, "Anyone who does not want to fight does not deserve the right to live." That is why he constantly spoke about natural selection, the right of the strongest, and was convinced of the existence of higher and lower races. In general, for him, politics is either preparing for war or waging war itself. Hitler wrote extensively about the living space needed to fulfill the needs of the nation and to live a quality, prosperous life. There is an interesting point here. Many researchers have noticed that Hitler was a supporter of technological progress, especially in the military sphere. But in his delusion about the need for living space for Germans, he lived in the categories of pre-industrial society, that is, the kind of society that existed in antiquity, the Middle Ages, or early modern times. The area of modern Germany. Germany is much smaller than the pre-war Third Reich and the Hohenzollern Empire, but its population is much larger. But the country lives successfully, is one of the most developed in Europe, and does not need any living space. But, according to Hitler, some countries have conquered too much territory and, accordingly, have too many resources. Other states have not done so, and they are suffocating from their borders, experiencing overpopulation, and because of this, they cannot feed themselves. Undoubtedly, he considered Germany to be an overpopulated country. That is why Hitler wrote that wars are inevitable, but they are wars for life. This is a form of natural selection. Kill a weaker neighbor to take his territory, property and live better. To provide for descendants.
The National Socialist movement will always determine its foreign policy based on the need to secure the space necessary for the life of our people. It does not use Germanization or Teutonization, but only the expansion of its nation. You will never see in the conquered, so-called Germanized Czechs or Poles a national strengthening, let alone an ethnic strengthening, only a racial weakening of our people.
In other words, as early as the 1930s, Hitler argued for the need for the Germans to conquer foreign territories, but I emphasize that this was without any Germanization of the conquered peoples. It follows that these conquered peoples must either be physically destroyed or deported, or forced to work. They were forced to work for the victors, i.e., reduced to the position of a subjugated population, a subordinate labor force, even without the right to dissolve into the dominant nation, the Germans. Hitler wrote that traditionally, historically, Germany had a weak navy and few colonies, and after the First World War there were no colonies at all. Therefore, Germany is not capable of fighting the United Kingdom, the ruler of the seas. It is much wiser not to challenge Britain from an initial losing position, and to direct German expansionism in the continental direction. Europe, Eurasia as a whole. First of all, to expand the living space to the east at the expense of Russia. He always wrote Russia, not the Soviet Union. He used only the phrase Russia. Why? Because there is a lower population density than in Germany, and the tradition of successful life of German colonists has existed for several centuries. And for this, Germany must have powerful ground forces capable of seizing the living space. Of course, the living space cannot be secured peacefully, so it is necessary to militarize German society so that the army is the main powerful force that can conquer these territories. Germany was not satisfied with the League of Nations because it was run by the winners of World War I. First of all, France and the United Kingdom, which, on the contrary, are interested in weakening Germany, so Hitler wrote that it is necessary to find allies who, like the Germans, want to break the Versailles-Washington system of international relations and build a new world. Hitler considered France to be his country's eternal, most dangerous, and main enemy, which acted in alliance with Great Britain. Why? One way or another, France has always acted in anti-German coalitions and has attacked German lands 29 times over the past 300 years. At the same time, looking to the future, Hitler saw the United States as the next major competitor for Germany and Europe as a whole. Here is another important point from Hitler's ideology. Hitler was disgusted, frankly disgusted, by the growth of the black population in France and mixed marriages between blacks and whites.
Europe is facing a danger of incredible proportions. The French discolor their blood to preserve the character of a numerically large nation. That is why France will be a perpetual troublemaker in the world until one day it learns a decisive and important lesson.
In addition, no one has better defined the nature of French vanity than Schopenhauer himself in his own statement: Africa has its monkeys, Europe its French. Who did Hitler see as Germany's main allies? First of all, it was Italy. Why Italy? They say that it is France's main competitor in the struggle for the Mediterranean basin, and therefore will never be able to act together with France. This brings the positions of Italy and Germany closer together. He also saw that Italy, like Germany, is a young nation-state. Let me remind you that Germany united in 1871, Italy in 1860, and finally in 1970, when the Papal States were added. It was almost simultaneously. As Hitler said, Italy, like Germany, suffers from overpopulation. And the country also needs a living space, and this space is the Balkans, the South Slavic territories. Former Yugoslavia. So, the direction of expansion of the Germans and Italians is completely different, they have no competition here. Hitler called Benito Mussolini a brilliant statesman who best defends the national interests of his homeland. And Hitler called fascist Italy the Third Rome. That is, it was not about Muscovy at all. For him, the Third Rome was fascist Italy, and he obviously considered ancient Rome to be the first Rome. The Roman Empire. The Second Rome is the medieval period when the Pope had a serious political influence. And the Third Rome is the time of Mussolini's fascist dictatorship. Hitler called the accession of 9 million Austrian Germans to the German state his main and primary mission. And that's why. He always believed that the continued existence of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was an extremely undesirable thing, so even after the defeat of the Central Powers, he perceived the collapse of Austria-Hungary as a positive event. He was always very critical of the alliance between Berlin and Vienna in the First World War, believing that this alliance only weakened Berlin, only dragged it down, and was in the interests of Vienna, not Berlin. Hitler wrote, "This alliance led to the conflict between Germany and Italy in World War I because the Italians had unresolved problems with Austria-Hungary. There was a struggle for territory, and because of this, the Germans had to fight against the Italians, who were allies of Austria-Hungary. He saw Germany's foreign policy ideal as an alliance with Italy and, in addition, with Great Britain. And, in his opinion, such an alliance could effectively confront France. And it would in no way prevent German expansion to the east against the Soviet Union. And in the future, such a powerful alliance of Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom will be able to compete successfully with the United States." Among secondary allies, he names Spain. Why Spain? Because it also competes with France, but very locally, in northern Africa, where the Spanish colonies were then. And Hungary. Because it seems to be gravitating toward an alliance with fascist Italy and is very hostile to the newly created Yugoslavia. So, the Germans must first defeat France, and then they must turn their attention to the east. From a historical perspective, we know that this happened. France was defeated in 1940. And in 1940, Hitler launched a military campaign against the Soviet Union. Already in the 1920s, he believed that any understanding with the Bolsheviks was impossible as long as their political regime existed, since they were striving for a world communist revolution and the enslavement of Germans through it. Hitler believed that the victory of Bolshevism in Germany would lead to the establishment of a Jewish dictatorship. Just as it exists today in Russia, he wrote. In addition, he believed that even if the possibility of an alliance between Germany and the USSR was theoretically possible, this alliance would not help Germany fight against European countries. He treated the Slavs with extreme contempt and wrote that they were not capable of their own statehood. He emphasized that the Russian Empire was actually dominated by ethnic Germans, and now the Soviet Union is dominated by Jews.
Slavism is generally deprived of any organizational abilities, and thus of state-building and state-preserving abilities. Remove from Slavism all elements that are not purely Slavic, and it immediately risks disintegrating as a state. Such a state will be a source of eternal unrest and perpetual danger. Thus, the fate of giant land regions will become unclear.
That is why, dear friends, when we sometimes hear the opinion that, for example, it would have been better for Ukraine if Hitler, not Stalin, had won the Second World War. It obviously comes from. This stems from a lack of familiarity with Hitler's theory. And second, it is based on modern knowledge of the nature of the Stalinist regime with its famines, repressions, and mass deportations. Hitler did not foresee the possibility of Ukraine's state existence. From the very beginning, he viewed its territory as a zone of German colonization, with a disenfranchised local population. Therefore, the tragedy of Ukraine in World War II was that it was caught between two totalitarian regimes that did not consider it a separate state. And its population and economic resources were used in their own interests, to achieve their imperial goals, inflicting enormous sacrifices on Ukrainians. How exactly did the National Socialists come to power? There is an interesting nuance here. Hitler remained an Austrian citizen until 1925. He received German citizenship only in 1932. The fact is that in 1925, when he was released from the Landsberg prison, he demonstratively renounced his Austrian citizenship. Because there was a threat of his deportation to Austria. After that, he managed to become a German citizen only at the age of 32, and then he was eligible to run for president. It was then, in 1932, that the presidential election was held, but he came in second, losing to Paul von Hindenburg. After his release from Landsberg prison in early 1925, Hitler met with the Bavarian prime minister and promised to stop all anti-government propaganda. On the contrary, to help the German authorities fight radicals and communists. Following these agreements, the authorities lifted the ban on the NSDAP. The Nazis announced that they were switching to legal methods of struggle and would now try to get elected to the German parliament. At the same time, their program and, accordingly, their leader, Adolf Hitler, remained unchanged, which distinguished the Nazi Party from other political forces in Germany. Because others sometimes literally drowned in internal strife. The number of Nazis gradually increased. In 1923 it was 55,000, and in 1929, according to various sources, from 130 to 178,000 people. At that time, regular congresses of the NSDAP were held. Youth organizations began to be created, as opposed to communist youth organizations. But still, until the end of the 20s, the NSDAP remained an unpopular force, as evidenced by the results of the parliamentary elections of 1928. At that time, the party officially took part in the elections for the first time under the name of the NSDAP and received only 2.6 of the votes, which was the ninth result and only 12 seats in the German parliament. It is likely that the NSDAP would have remained a locally unpopular party if not for the global economic crisis that erupted in the fall of 1929. The crisis hit Germany extremely hard, primarily because it was paying reparations and was highly dependent on foreign loans, which simply stopped being issued during the crisis. As a result, industrial production in the country fell by 40% in 3 years, and 6 million Germans became unemployed. Only the United States has lost more people's jobs, but the population there is twice as large as in Germany. By the way, the population of the United States is now 4 times larger than that of Germany. And against the background of these tragic events, Hitler's criticism of the current government was gaining more and more supporters, and people were attracted to the NSDAP's social program. This program promised to completely eliminate unemployment. The majority of Germans, frankly, were ready to give up their democratic freedoms in order for a so-called strong hand to come to power and restore order in the country. As they sadly joked back then, democracy gave us only the freedom to be hungry. In addition, revanchism remained a popular theme for Germans who felt the outcome of World War I was unjust. In addition, Germany's situation was too complicated, and the search for those responsible for the defeat in World War I continued. Who was to blame? The Nazis always blamed Marxists and Jews. Therefore, the results of the next election clearly demonstrate how the NSDAP's popularity grew. In 1930, they came in second in the elections, winning over 19% of the vote and 107 seats, as opposed to 12 seats 2 years earlier. But this still did not mean coming to power. Their rise to power was the result of a very long political crisis, from which the government was trying to find at least some way out. So, follow the sequence of events. July of 1932, new parliamentary elections. The NSDAP wins first place with a very large margin of more than 37% of the vote and 230 seats. Hermann Göring, Hitler's deputy, was elected chairman of the Reichstag. However, Hitler himself refused to join the coalition government as a minister. He only wanted to be chancellor. President Hindenburg refused to appoint him chancellor, or simply did not dare. Therefore, it was impossible to form a government in the absence of representatives of the largest Nazi party in parliament. There is no government, and new early parliamentary elections were held in November of 1932. Moreover, the political struggle at this time is taking place in the context of increasing violence in the country, with clashes between Nazi stormtroopers and communist militants, where the number of victims is estimated at dozens. This time, in November 1932, the Nazis got worse results. In July it was 37%, and in November it was 33%. In July, there were 230 mandates, and in November, there were 196. But they still remained in first place. The Social Democrats came in second among all other parties. The Communists got 17% and third place. That is, the Nazis and the German Communists, 33 and 17%, got a majority in the parliament. But the parties categorically refused to enter into a coalition with each other, of course, but they also categorically refused to enter into a coalition with other political forces. The political crisis is dragging on, it has been going on for many months. And President Hindenburg was more afraid of the Communists coming to power than the Nazis. As a field marshal and an aristocrat, he naturally treated Corporal Hitler with contempt and caution. But still considered him a better option. Hitler was more patriotic German power. In addition, at that time in Europe and in Germany, Hitler was partly perceived as a kind of bad copy of Mussolini. And Mussolini, as we already know, during the 1920s more or less managed to lead Italy out of a long political and economic crisis. In the face of this protracted political crisis, Hindenburg was granted extraordinary powers under the Weimar Republic's constitution. In particular, the right to appoint a chancellor even without the support of a majority in parliament. And after a personal meeting on January 30, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor. This first cabinet of Hitler was called the Government of National Salvation, and was a coalition in which the Nazis won only 3 seats. In addition to Hitler, Wilhelm Frick became the Minister of the Interior. And the minister without a portfolio is Hermann Göring. The other 9 portfolios in the government were given to non-partisans or representatives of the Conservative National People's Party. Only after that, representatives of big business began to actively finance the Nazis. The process started earlier, but it was the emergence of a government with Hitler at the head and a strong election result that led to the creation of a 3 million mark NSDAP campaign support fund. Hitler secured new early parliamentary elections, which were scheduled for March 5. It was the third parliamentary election in a year. But shortly before these elections, on the evening of February 27, the Reichstag was set on fire. 24-year-old Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe was found guilty of arson. This event is well known, but all its details are still unknown. There are 2 main versions. The first version is that the Nazis themselves set fire to the Reichstag, and Marinus van der Lubbe was simply made a scapegoat. And the second version, and this is the more popular version now, is that van der Lubbe set fire to the Reichstag himself. Or the option that the Nazis knew about his plans to set fire to the Reichstag, but did not intervene and simply took advantage of the situation. Van der Lubbe himself was arrested. A trial was held in Leipzig, where he was sentenced to death, and in January 1934 he was executed by guillotine. The burning of the Reichstag was perceived by the German authorities as a signal for the beginning of a communist uprising. To get ahead of him, the very next day, on February 28, 1933, Hindenburg signed a decree on the protection of the people and the state. And according to the decree, freedom of speech, press, assembly, and rallies were abolished in the country, and it was allowed to check correspondence and listen to telephone conversations. Massive searches and arrests began, and up to 27,000 people were arrested in a few months. To hold such a huge number of prisoners, the first concentration camps began to be set up in Germany. However, it should be noted that most of the prisoners were released fairly quickly, in the range of several weeks to several months, after the inspection. On March 5, new early parliamentary elections were held, in which the Nazi Party again took first place, but with a large result of 44%. The result was excellent, but it still did not allow them to form a government on their own. As before, the Social Democratic Party came in second, and the Communist Party third. But immediately after the election, the Communist Party was banned and their parliamentary mandates were cancelled, and the Communists lost 81 seats in total. Now, after this abolition, the Nazi Party has gained a majority in parliament. After all, in the absence of 81 deputies, the Nazis created a small but mono-majority with their own number of deputy mandates. On March 24, 1933, the new parliament passes the law on overcoming the hardship of the people and the state. This law gave the government the right to pass laws bypassing the parliament. Even those that did not comply with the constitution of the Weimar Republic. Thus, the executive branch gained legislative powers, and the parliament actually turned into a decorative body imitating democracy. In addition, the government was given full freedom to sign any international agreements. Such emergency powers were granted to the government for 4 years, but then extended until the fall of the Nazi regime in 1945. Finally, on July 14, 1933, the law, on the prohibition of the creation of new parties, was adopted, which was called that, but in fact. This law declared the Nazi Party the only legal party in the state. All left-wing parties were simply banned, and right-wing non-Nazi political parties were asked to either join the NSDAP or to liquidate themselves. And after July 14, the official opposition in Germany simply did not exist, it could only be illegal. However, Hitler faced a very unexpected threat from his fellow party members. A conflict with stormtroopers under the command of Ernst Röhm began. He applied for the post of Minister of War. Now his stormtroopers were actually competing with the army and police, which were under Hitler's control. The stormtroopers were armed with cold steel and firearms. Some of them were even armed with machine guns, so it was something like a militia. So, the situation was like this. Stormtroopers, which were originally created to protect the Nazi Party, to achieve their political goals, including the use of brute force. This is a kind of huge militia, a state within a state. They are run by Röhm, and he wants the attack aircraft to be declared part of the German armed forces. And then he would be able to lead these armed forces, but Hitler understood the consequences of such actions. In this case, Röhm would get a huge power apparatus in his hands and then he could simply eliminate Hitler. He therefore decides to be proactive and accuse Röhm of preparing a coup d'état. On June 30 and July 1, 1934, Hitler and his supporters organized the famous Night of the Long Knives. The executors were the state army and the SS security units. Earlier, they were created as Hitler's bodyguards in the party, i.e., the most loyal to the Führer, competitors of Ernst Röhm's stormtroopers. During the Night of the Long Knives, according to official figures, a little more than 80 people died, but according to modern researchers, 150–200, including leading figures of the stormtroopers, including Ernst Röhm himself. But in the course of this, not only the leaders of the stormtroopers fell victim, but also politicians of the Weimar Republic who had nothing to do with it at all but criticized Hitler. Or simply those who have interfered with him in the past, such as Gregor Strasser. Gregor Strasser used to be a member of the Nazi Party, but then he and Hitler parted ways. What happened on the Night of the Long Knives was explained to the people as a precautionary measure against the inevitable putsch of the stormtroopers. And the result was an extraordinary increase in Hitler's power. Weakening of the assault units, their role was reduced mainly to propaganda functions. Conversely, the strengthening of the role of the SS, the security forces of the Nazi Party and the Gestapo, the secret state police Geheime Staatspolizei. Very soon afterward, an event occurred that completed the formation of the Nazi dictatorship. On the morning of August 2, 1934, Paul von Hindenburg died, at the age of 86. This is a photo from his funeral. Immediately after his death, the post of German president was abolished. And Hitler assumed the powers of Führer and Reich Chancellor, i.e., head of state and head of government. In addition, the position and powers of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Previously, the president had these powers. To legitimize this decision, a referendum was held on August 19, 1934, in which almost 90% of the participants supported this innovation. This was the second Nazi referendum, as the first took place in November 1933. And then 95% spoke in favor of Germany leaving the League of Nations. We talked about this political practice, which the Nazis resorted to several times during their rule, in the pseudo-referendums issue, where we compared Hitler's actions to Putin's actions in the temporarily occupied territories. Thus, in August 1934, the Nazi dictatorship was finally established in Germany. But it is worth noting that, despite the ideological closeness of Hitler's Nazism and Italian fascism, there were very serious differences between them. German historian and journalist Sebastian Gaffner emphasized,
in the ranks of 20th-century dictators, Hitler stands somewhere between Mussolini and Stalin, closer to Stalin on closer inspection than to Mussolini. There is nothing more wrong than calling Hitler a fascist. Fascism is the rule of the upper classes of society based on artificially created mass enthusiasm. Hitler was a populist who relied on the masses, not the elites. In a sense, he was a people's tribune who sought absolute power. His most important means of power was demagoguery, and his instrument of power was not a differentiated hierarchy, but a chaotic tangle of uncoordinated mass organizations that were held together only by his personality at the head. All of these movements were more left-wing than right-wing.
Thus, in the summer of 1934, Hitler reached the fullness of power and the peak of his domestic political success. For him, the time had come for a large-scale transformation of the country to the Nazi system, according to his program, and, of course, for a transition to changes in foreign policy, primarily to the destruction of the Versailles system of international relations. In just 5 years, this policy would lead to the outbreak of the bloodiest conflict in the history of World War II. Dear friends, let me remind you that we, together with the volunteer organization Group of 35, are conducting a large and very important collection of attack drones for the 68th Separate Hunting Brigade named after Alexa Dovbush, which is currently conducting combat operations against the Russian occupiers in Donbass. This weapon will help stop enemy attacks and create opportunities for a pointed massive attack to break through Russian positions. The total amount required is $14,000. This amount will be used to purchase 2 ground control stations, 2 drones and 4 kamikaze drones. Please, dear friends, join in. Each hryvnia is important. Each of your hryvnia brings our victory over the enemy closer. Dear viewers, unfortunately, we have problems with the internet today, so there will be no answers to questions from the chat. Thank you very much for your attention. Do not forget to subscribe to History Without Myths. Don't forget to click the bell, like this issue and leave a comment. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you next time. Glory to Ukraine.